Good afternoon. Today we are very honored and privileged to have a special guest in studio of Polish Media Center at Orchard Lake Schools, Professor Geneviève Zubrzycki, Professor of Sociology at the University of Michigan. I looked and her curriculum vitae is very impressive, beautiful academic career here at the University of Michigan and many other schools of higher education in France, Netherlands, many awards. Probably the most important would be Guggenheim Fellowship in 2021, as well as Bronisław Malinowski's Award of Social Sciences, and also probably quite recently Wayne Vucinic Book Prize in 2023. Professor Zubrzycki's area of scientific interest is closely related to Polish milieu, and I would like to start this interview asking for more details about herself and some information about the area of her professional expertise. Welcome, Professor Zubrzycki.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here today.
Let's start. What can you tell us about yourself, a little bit about your professional background, what you do, and then we will go later on why such interest in Poland and Polish issues, actually.
So I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Michigan. I'm originally from Canada, from Quebec. So that's what explains my French first name and my Polish last name. I think we'll talk about this a little later, but I'm of Polish origins, a mixed French and Polish. I've been in the US since 1995 because I did my doctoral work and obtained my PhD from the University of Chicago. And then I was very fortunate to obtain a position at the University of Michigan right after that. I'm also director of the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies here at U of M since I think 2010. So it's my 15th year. I'm very proud of what we do here for the University of Michigan community, faculty, students, but also for the Ann Arbor Polonia and for the greater Detroit area Polonia. My own research is on national identity. I'm a researcher of nationalism, national identity, how it interacts or relates with religion. I'm also very interested in collective memory and the politics of commemoration. And therefore, my research has been empirically on the Polish case, but also on the Canadian case. I've written 2 books on Poland, 1 on Quebec, but they touch upon very similar questions of identity and the relationship between national identity and religious identity. That's in very broad strokes. Then we can go into the detail of the empirical cases if you're interested.
You told us already that you have some Polish background, but why that particular subject? I mean, okay, I know that I read that you studied Polish language when you were very young girl, still at that time. And that was, okay, your trip to Poland and learning Polish language was connected because you had in perspective this kind of research or this actually Polish language and Polish background pushed you to this kind of subject of your doctoral dissertations?
So I'm going to go back a little because I started learning Polish in 1989. I was 19 years old, and my grandfather, who immigrated to Canada during World War II, told me I still have a sister in Szczecin. She's getting older. If you want to learn Polish now, would be a good time before she retires with her children who lived in Vienna. And so I went to Poland before going to McGill University, starting college. So in between, just the summer before college. And it changed my life. I was supposed to study law at McGill University. In Canada, you can do a bachelor's in law. And I arrived in Poland on June 2nd, 1989. So you can imagine what I saw that summer. I didn't speak a word of Polish because we spoke French at home. My Polish grandparents lived far away. My parents were divorced, actually, so I had little relationship with the Polish side of the family. But I was very curious. I was curious, and I wanted to know even how to pronounce my name, because in Canada we pronounce it Zubrzycki, because my grandparents went through France before coming to Canada. And I arrived in Poland in a very, very important historical time, at a historical turning point. And I witnessed this collective effervescence around Solidarność. And I decided that then, I sent a telegram to my mother and I said, change my course of study. I don't want to do law. I want to learn Polish. So change my major to Slavic studies and history.
Yeah,
And
just
so
let's remind people that it was close to June
June
4th, which
4th,
was this election, the first partially free election in Poland,
yes.
and changing the last days of communism.
And my great aunt on that day took me to church at Jerzy Popiełuszko's church, with speakers outside and a church overflowing in the streets. And for me, it was a revelation. I had never seen anything of that sort. And it reminded me of what my mother, who's French Canadian, would tell me about what Quebec used to be before the 1960s. So I was looking at Poland through some kind of comparative lens of what it used to be in Quebec and was no longer. And at McGill, I started studying Polish, and then I did a year-long program at UJ at Jagiellonian University, Polish Language and Culture. And then I started learning Polish. So that's much before I did a master's degree or my PhD. And in the 1990s, I spent about 3 years in Poland, learning Polish, taking classes, returning to Montreal, doing my degrees. And then when I started my PhD work, it was clear I would do it on Poland. I was initially interested in what would happen to the Catholic Church after the building of a democratic state, after Poland's recovery of national independence. I was interested to see if the Catholic Church would lose power in Poland, if Poland would secularize in a way that it had actually in French Canada after 1960s. Once you have a state that's recognized as legitimate and really of and for the people, unlike what it was under communism, would people remain really faithful to Catholicism and to the Catholic Church? So that was my initial idea for my doctoral dissertation work. And I did study that and showed how and why actually Poles remained attached to Catholicism, remained faithful to the Catholic Church. But then I went also in different directions, studying memory contests between Poles and Jews about the history of World War II. So in terms of my academic trajectory, coming from Quebec and thinking of myself as primarily a French Canadian of Polish descent, I went to Poland and rediscovered my Polish side of the family, became very attached to the Polish side of the family, discovering long lost cousins. And then I was looking at Poland from a comparative Canadian angle. And after my first book, then I did a book on Quebec. And then I was looking at Quebec from the Polish perspective. So I'm doing this kind of back and forth as a way to think about national identity and the relationship of national identity to religion.
And just when we are at this particular subject, do you see a lot of comparison between the situation which was in Quebec and in Poland in many areas?
I do, but historically. So I think that historically, Poland, Quebec, and Ireland are often in sociology and in the historical literature put as exceptions to the rule of secularization. That because those three societies did not have independent states, and because they had been colonized by neighbors or political powers that were of a different faith, so Protestants in Quebec Protestants and the Orthodox in Poland, and Protestants also in Ireland. It led to fusing Catholicism and national identity into a specific form of national identity. So the Polak Catholic in Poland and in French Canada too. To be French Canadian was to be Catholic, and in Ireland as well. So I was interested to see, how that happens, and then what happens when there's an independent state, and when people can, identify to state structures outside of religious ones. So yes, there are a lot of parallels actually between Poland and Quebec, and that's what struck me historically about the case. And in the literature, those three nations are very often put together as that. Why didn't Poland secularize in 19th century when other societies did in Europe? Why Quebec or Ireland? Well, it's because they were not independent. And the church served a very important role in keeping national identity alive.
And in some way, you were very lucky because having experience from Quebec, allowed you to look on Poland and this issue from very good perspective, because very often Americans do not understand what's going on over there, why they are so strange. And the same from Polish perspective, they very often they cannot find themselves why they behave like they behave, and so on.
Right.
And okay, and but why all of a sudden your doctoral dissertation, and finally the first book, was focused on that particular issue of Polish Jewish, background, situation over there. Especially, I know from your book that there was experience of those famous crosses of in Auschwitz. Some people probably don't remember this. I remember this very well, why that particular? Because probably issue of Polish nationality and Polish religion, in this case Catholicism, was much broader than just that particular issue. And you touched a very specific issue of Polish relation with Judaism in this case.
Well, for a few reasons. First of all, I did not initially want to touch anything to do with Polish-Jewish relations, because these are very, very complex, very painful. People have very strong feelings about this, and I didn't feel like that I was ready to step in that topic. But I became more and more interested in the role of religious symbols and narratives about national identity. As I was doing my research for my dissertation, I became less interested in issues of institutions and more about how people feel about their national identity, how they express their national identity, how are their emotions about their national identity expressed. So I became very interested in material culture, religious culture, in religious symbols and national symbols. And in the case of Poland, national culture is very, very, almost intrinsically related to Catholic culture, right? So that carrying a cross, for example, in the 19th century or in the 1980s, was not only a Christian ritual, it was a political. It was, not just religious, it was also political. And just as I was really digging into the relationship between the use of religious symbols, the use of religious metaphors to express national identity, this war of Auschwitz, the war of the crosses at Auschwitz, was happening. I was in Poland, I lived in Poland, and I was regularly in Poland throughout the 1990s. So I witnessed, for example, the Carmelite convent controversy, then, debates about the papal cross in the early 1990s, and then in 1997 and 1998, the War of the Crosses, but also the debate around the preamble to the 1997 Polish Constitution. Should we say my naród polski or my obywatele polscy? You know, how to refer to this? Should there be an invocation day in the, and these are all symbolic things that are very, very important and that goes to the heart of Polish national identity. So then they offered a window into questions that were broader than simply the debate around Oświęcim or Auschwitz. It was also allowing me to understand how Western audiences and Jewish audiences think about Auschwitz and how Poles think about Oświęcim, you know, and the conflation that in the West we think of Auschwitz as something that's very, very broad, whereas in Poland, Oświęcim and Brzezinka are two very different places and different symbols. So there was also my desire to explain to different audiences that there was a lot of misunderstandings about, you know, when, for example, there were debates in the US that, oh, Poles are opening a supermarket at Auschwitz. No, there's a supermarket opening in Oświęcim, not in the concentration camp, right? So I was really wanting to disentangle all of these complex issues to kind of clarify different aspects that were becoming very, very important conflicts between nation states, between Poland, Israel, the US, and a variety of Western European countries.
You would be very surprised, but when I went in Poland to school, we never learned about those Jews being killed, you know. And as a matter of fact, we couldn't say Auschwitz. It was forbidden. It was Oświęcim, Brzezinka. And only coming here, I learned that actually the biggest tragedy happened with the Jewish people over there, not Poles. And therefore, it was probably you already experienced this with preparing your dissertations, that a lot of Polish people had a problem with this to accept this historical reality over there. And definitely that was a big influence on later on you know on the conflicts which later on appeared over there.
And I would say that a lot of people in the West did not know that non-Jewish Poles were also victims in World War II, that Poles had tremendous losses. So the book was also trying to offer, you know, answers or provide keys to understanding some of those misunderstandings. And you know, for 50 or 60 years, Poles were taught that Oświęcim, you know, was the site of Polish martyrdom. And in a way it was, because the camp was initially created for Polish political prisoners, right? The first victims were people of Polish elites, priests, nuns, professors, doctors, lawyers, etc., Soviet prisoners of wars, etc. So, I mean, there's a lot of disinformation in a way on all sides. So the book wanted to explain this, but also get to the root of why Poles express their national identity through religious symbols.
And did you discover a big transformation from your first time when you were in Oświęcim or Auschwitz, and then, let's say, quite recently, about Polish understanding of this, of complexity of this area, or?
Oh, absolutely. In 1989 and throughout the 1990s, I mean, and I discussed that in the book also. I mean, Poles understood Auschwitz as their primary symbol of martyrdom, and Jews were barely mentioned. That changes after 1992 when the Soviet archives open, and then people could actually identify very clearly victims, and then it was established that about 90% of the victims of Auschwitz-Birkenau, you know, the entire complex, were Jewish, and that the largest number of Jewish victims were actually Hungarian Jews, 400,000. So there has been a lot of education in Poland about that. And one thing that helped too is the acknowledgement by the Russians that cutting was, or that they were responsible for cutting. And that became another important site of official martyrdom for Poles. It had been in the unofficial underground memory and commemorations, but after the acknowledgement of those crimes by Russians, it took them a long time. People could also build a different form of memory around their victims. So Poland had Oświęcim as an important place, and about 80,000 Poles were murdered at Auschwitz or Auschwitz I. But then, there's Katyn and there's other places. And after the fall of communism, it was possible to speak about the terrible losses that Poles suffered during World War II.
Another issue also, which you touch a little bit in your book, and namely their open, at least the start of discussion about the problem of Poles who actually were not only victims but also were persecutors of the Jewish people, especially in the northern part of Poland, the Jedwabne, famous, which still a lot of Poles have a problem to recognize as a historical fact. And that probably moved even farther, recognizing that the entire issue of relations between Poles and Jews and victims of Poles and victims of Jews, who were
So I think
probably.
that, so I don't study historical things per se, I study how they are remembered. And to me, there's no question that this issue of Jedwabne and the publication of the book Sąsiedzi in 2000 by Jan Gross has been one of the most important changes in Polish historiography, but also collective memory. And painful events like this are contested. They become debated, just like the legacy of slavery or the genocide of Native Americans, for example, in the US, is contested, and people have a difficult time coming to terms with this. But Poland has actually done, a lot of work to
Still has to be
discuss this.
done a lot. Yeah.
Has done a lot, has
Yeah.
scratched a lot of
Yeah.
scabs and things that were very unpleasant and difficult to accept. So I was very interested also in why is it so difficult to accept that many Poles participated in violent crimes against Jews. And one of the reasons is that Poles for centuries now have thought of themselves as martyrs, right? And also as Christ among nations, and that the telling of Polish history is told on this kind of narrative, of romantic narrative of Poles as great martyrs who fight for freedom. Well, this is how Poles feel about themselves and their histories. It becomes very, very difficult, more difficult to accept that they might have victimized others.
And plus, the Jews very often were not seen as being Polish, even if very often they became. You mentioned in your book also that this is how actually you should talk Polish Jews or Jewish Poles, which is probably very good description, who they are, and very often Poles did not want to recognize them as equal citizens of that particular country, or that particular state.
So I think that before the Second World War, like everywhere in Europe, there was a rise of anti-Semitism, rise of right-wing nationalism that was very strong in Poland, like in many other countries. And it is true that Jews were not always seen as full Polish citizens. And that was very painful for Jews who in great numbers were assimilated and actually felt Polish. So that also explains part of the tensions in Polish-Jewish relations, that Jews who felt they were Polish, that spoke Polish, wrote in Polish, participated in Polish life, were not defended like they thought they should have, because they were not seen as fully Polish. And then there's a lot of hurt on the Jewish side that we were Polish and we were left to be slaughtered by the Nazis. So I think that in Polish-Jewish relations, these are, trauma upon trauma for generations that also get passed down, that makes a dialogue that's very, very difficult. But that's essential to happen.
But I don't know if you ever experienced, but whenever I met some Jews here in the United States with some Polish background, they are actually very proud of being Poles. They start even speaking few words in Polish, and I never had any kind of feelings of enmity or anything against Polish. They were very, very warm feelings, and they were searching for some connection with Poland, and they said, "Oh yeah, I was there, and my parents or grandparents," and I was very, very impressed, because from Polish perspective in Poland, especially when right now there are not too many Jews left, they think that they really hate us. That the Jewish people are so against Poland that even they started to use this word, anti-Polonism, which is very, very strange over here. And but today, when you see based on your research, how would you describe today the danger between this nationalism, which very often is mixed with patriotism and nationalism in this negative terms, and also involvement of religion? Isn't it some kind of very dangerous mixture? In America, actually, right now we could see how very often it's used or abused actually by politicians. What would be your comment?
Well, I think that it's not necessarily, I wouldn't say that the blending of religious and national identities into a single, identity is necessarily dangerous or violent or aggressive or anti-Semitic or anti-anything. It can be mobilized to be so, but so does secular nationalism. You also have patriotism that can become, violent forms of nationalism. So I wouldn't say that this is necessarily the case. It can, but not always. So my question is, when does it become the case and why? And I think that the transition, for example, that moment of transition of the fall of communism and the rebuilding of a Polish state was a moment where all lines that had been drawn for 50 years, right? Us versus them, for example, us, the nation, versus them, the party state, had to be realigned. People needed to find their own people, right? And then you had at the beginning in 1990s, dozens of political parties. And now it's getting to a more kind of quote unquote normal party system where you have 7 or 8, for example. But the threat of populism in the Polish case, populism and right-wing nationalism tends to mobilize religious identities. It's not left-wing populism in Poland that's happening. It's a right-wing populism that tends to mobilize the right wing of the Catholic Church. And then that's what we have seen under peace. For example, a close alliance between the hierarchy of the church and the more conservative wing of the church, and the censorship of more liberal or progressive wing of the Catholic Church associated with the Tygodnik Powszechny, for example, Ksiądz Boniecki, or people like him.
Very interesting. And just, we already talked about your Polish language, but you already told us why and why. But maybe you could say a couple of words in Polish just to say to show us your proficiency in this language. Just couple of words. Where did you study and or something? No.
Tak, więc studiowałam na UJ w Krakowie, skończyłam kurs języka polskiego, roczny kurs języka polskiego w Krakowie. Kocham Kraków. Mieszkałam w Krakowie przez chyba 3 lata i zawsze tam wracam. I to jest bardzo ciekawe, moja córka, która skończyła high school rok temu, teraz robi gap year właśnie tam, gdzie ja byłam, więc ten sam kurs języka polskiego mieszka w tym samym akademiku co ja. Dom akademicki, dom studencki Piast. Więc jestem bardzo dumna z tego i ona już zaczyna mówić po polsku, nawet pisze do mnie SMS-y po polsku. Więc jestem zwłaszcza dumna z tego, że ja jestem trzecie pokolenie. Mój ojciec się urodził we Francji podczas wojny. Jego rodzina przyjechała do Kanady, wyemigrowała do Kanady w latach 40. 1940s, to jest trudne.
40. 40.
Tak. I teraz moja córka jest z 4. pokolenia. Mówimy po francusku w domu. Ona ma francuskie imię, bo ja mam, to jest moja, tak, tożsamość jest związana najbardziej z Quebec. Ale jednak, ona już studiuje po polsku, studiuje polski, język polski. Więc ja mam ogromny sentyment do Polski. Pracuję na uniwersytecie, prowadzę ten Centrum Studiów Polskich i nie wiem.
I'm amazed, my goodness. You see, I expected that would be some kind of talk like very often I could hear in Polish over here with Polish communities sometimes they speak. You speak perfect. That is the perfect. And Polish is a very difficult. You never spoke Polish when you were a child?
No.
At home? You only there? Oh my goodness.
No, but I can recommend that course. If you want to, you can tell your people, if you want your children to learn Polish, send them to Krakow for a year. I did go back and I had a lot of friends. I had narzeczony, for a while. That was Krakow. So I spoke a lot of Polish.
That's practice is always the best in
practice is the best.
Yeah, anyway, I mean, there's so many topics which we'll probably talk, and I hope that we will have opportunity in the future to talk about some other aspects. Maybe some listeners will give us some kind of subject what they would like to hear.
I want to invite all of your listeners and people związani, so tied to Old Orchard, to come visit us in Ann Arbor. We will host, for example, Rafał Trzaskowski is coming September 19th. We'll give the annual Copernicus lecture. We try to have a variety of Polish speakers, so politicians, artists, scholars to come to meet with us. So please come on September 19th and don't hesitate to email us, come visit anytime. We're there for you.
No, I don't want to sound a little bit, how to say this, diminishing the Polonia over here, but I know that Ann Arbor is this high class, Polish high culture of Polish. For example, we have this festival of Polish films over there. We have a lot of very high academic level of Polish culture, which is a wonderful, and thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, and definitely we will be in touch for the future, because I'm pretty sure, especially younger generation, would be very interested to learn more, especially from somebody who was not born there, and actually, as you said, third, fourth generation. Maybe one day with your daughter, when she comes back, she will give her expression of how is this for
Oh,
fourth generation? That would be wonderful
yes,
over there.
that'd be great.
Okay. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.